Hello, Mishpucha, it's Courtney, America's Jewish mother. Welcome back to my channel. As you can see, I'm in a different filming location from usual, and that's because I came up to my parents' house in North Carolina for Thanksgiving, and I'm leaving going back to Athens tomorrow. So there's been a lot going on here because my parents got a new dog the weekend that I got here. And he's a rescue. He's very cute. He's some kind of pit hound or shepherd mix, probably. We don't know for sure. And his name is Walter, but we're going to call him Wally for short. So I will insert a clip of him and Char here. This is Wally. Say hi, Wally. Say hi. So anyway, so they have been, getting used to each other, and Wally's been getting used to us and the house and the new surroundings and everything like that. So he seems to be settling in okay. He and Char do tend to go at it a little bit, hopefully. But I think probably that's partially a result of their age discrepancy. So Char is almost 7 now and Wally's about 2, and I think he wants to play more than she does, so I'm sure eventually they'll sort of settle down with each other. But they're doing all right, and we're enjoying the new dog. So so that was all happening. But I did in fact manage to finish 2 books this week. So the first of those was Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. This is a classic, modern classic of African literature, and basically it tells the story of Okonkwo, who is an Igbo man living in probably Nigeria, we assume, and you hear about his family life and his upbringing, and we hear about his sort of growth into adulthood and the wives that he takes and the children that he has, etc., etc. in the first, I'm going to say about 60% or so of the novel, and then in the latter 40%, suddenly Okonkwo's world is sort of threatened because he is put into exile by his clan for reasons I'm not going to get into here so as to avoid spoilers, but he is exiled by the clan for a number of years because of something he did, and during that time white missionaries come to the African continent, and specifically to villages around where Okonkwo is from, and start establishing churches and converting the native African peoples, etc., and pretty much threatens their whole way of life. So that's the basis of the book. And I said in my Goodreads review of this that I felt pretty similarly about this book as I did about A Tale of Two Cities, which I read last month. So the first half or more of this to me was pretty boring and slow going. But once the white missionaries showed up, there seemed to be more, well, once Okonkwo gets exiled and then the missionaries show up, there seemed to be a lot more narrative tension going on in the book. And so it seemed more exciting and engaging to me in the latter, again, maybe about 40%. And so for that reason, I ended up giving this book 3.5 stars. I am glad that I read it, especially as it is a sort of modern classic of African literature. But yeah, I'm maybe not so sad that it took me this long to get around to reading it. Let's just say that. So yeah, I would still recommend it, especially if you are interested in African literature, especially seeing aspects of colonization from the point of view of the colonized. I also think something that this book hammers home toward the end is that oftentimes with an enemy you can't just rely on physical strength and brute force to overcome or subdue them. Sometimes you have to rely on mental acuity, and that's something Okonkwo really doesn't know how to do, and a skill that he has not cultivated. So I did like it overall, but had it not been for the sort of greater narrative tension in the last 40% of the book, I would not have rated this quite as highly. But again, I would still recommend it, especially if you're interested in African literature, because it is a pretty seminal book, as far as this was one of the first books that kind of put African literature on the map of Western readers. So I'd recommend it for no other reason than that. So 3.5 stars. The other book I finished this week was Laila Lalami's The Moor's Account. So I did this as a buddy read with Melissa, a fully booked. I really loved this book, so I ended up giving it 4.5 stars. It tells the story of a fictionalized story of a real historical figure, Mustafa al-Zamori, who we only know one line about this man's life that's in the historical record, and this was from a book written by Cabeza de Vaca, who is also a real historical figure, but is also a character in this book, where he talks about the Narvaez expedition, the ill-fated Narvaez expedition, where only 4 people ultimately end up surviving. And the only line that it says in Cabeza de Vaca's chronicle, historical chronicle, is the 4th survivor was Estebanico, an Arab Negro originally from Azamor. And that's literally all Laila Lalami had to go on. And she basically decided to tell the story from Estebanico's perspective and, you know, kind of give him a whole backstory. And I really love this book. So it's not a book that I think when you sort of first hear about it necessarily sounds particularly interesting, because it is set during the 1500s, so 16th century, yeah. During the conquest by Spanish and Castilian conquistadors of the New World. And so for the first about half of the book, it alternates between, but the whole book's told from Mustafa's perspective. It alternates between the sort of present day timeline of the Narvaez expedition landing in Florida and meeting a number of native people and trying to find gold and survive, etc., etc. So it alternates between that and then a previous timeline where we see how Mustafa / Estebanico ended up becoming a slave in the first place. So we see sort of his childhood and his growing up and how he comes to be enslaved. And then once we get past about the midway point of the book, it all switches back to the present day timeline of the novel. So yeah, I really love this because it has a lot of emphasis on who gets to tell stories and why and which stories get told. It also has a lot of emphasis on freedom and who decides about your own freedom, and whether that's something that can actually be given to you by someone else or if it's something you have to take into your own hands, etc., etc. And I really loved Estebanico / Mustafa as a narrator because he was very reflective. He was not, 100% pure or innocent of things. He definitely felt some guilt over things that he had done in his life that were not great. But it was very interesting to see his point of view compared to the Castilians, and then once there are only 4 survivors left, himself, Cabeza de Vaca, Castillo, and Dorantes, his original master, the dynamic certainly shifts at that point, and that's interesting to see. So yeah, I really liked this, and I would recommend it, especially if you are interested in, contemporary historical fiction, or specifically historical fiction that has to do with the time of the conquistadors. And I think one thing I really liked about this is that Estebanico is the only, / Mustafa is the only narrator, so we follow his perspective the whole way through, and I really like that because I felt like we got to know him really well as a character. So the only things about this book that I maybe didn't like as much is because it's written in the style of an old-timey travelogue, like something like the interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano, it's a bit slow going at first. And then the other thing that I maybe didn't like as much about it is it does that annoying thing where it doesn't actually put quotation marks around when people are talking. And I've become used to that now, but whenever I see it, I'm still kind of just like, oh, this again. Like, how hard would it have been to put in quotation marks? Just say. So those are the only sort of cons, but again, very sort of minor criticisms of an otherwise very strong book. So yeah, 4.5 stars. Would definitely recommend it. and loved reading it. It was a book that I told Melissa in my last Voxer check-in that I feel like definitely kind of hit me at the right time. So I think if I'd read this book at another time, I think I still would have been impressed by it, because it is impressive how Laila Lalami is able to kind of capture the tone of an old-timey travelogue. And it is impressive still how much complexity there is in her character of Mustafa. But I think because I read it at this particular sort of moment in time, especially during the pandemic, it just hit me even more right. So 4.5 stars, loved it. So those were the 2 books that I finished this week. So I am currently reading 5 books. My other 2 of them are buddy reads. So one of those other buddy reads is Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem, which I am doing as a buddy read with Stephanie Cohen, BookTube commenter extraordinaire. So we are about 3/4 of the way through this book, and we should finish it up. I'll finish this up before we get into December. And yeah, this is interesting. There were a number of chapters where Hannah Arendt basically talks about how different countries responded to the demands of the Nazi Party and how the Jewish populations of those countries fared as a result. And, you know, it wasn't something that I had given a lot of thought to before, but it makes complete sense, right? Like, obviously, the government of the country and the way that people already felt disposed towards Jews is going to make a big difference in terms of how many Jewish survivors there ultimately were once the Nazis came in and started making demands about X, Y, and Z. And yeah, it seemed like Romania was probably the worst country where Jews fared, because there was already a lot of pre-existing anti-Semitism that was just sort of fomented even more once the Nazis came in. And the country where they seemed to fare the best was Denmark, I think. And that's because the Danes were very sort of steadfast about Jews being, you know, having sort of equal citizenship and, you know, going out of their way to, or, you know, saying that they would go out of their way to protect them, etc., etc. So I thought that was quite interesting. Another thing that I just read this morning that I found quite striking was this was testimony that was given during Eichmann's trial by a man who was at this point an Israeli lawyer. So this man said that those who had survived, this is talking about Jewish survivors, those who had survived the ghettos and the camps, who had come out alive from the nightmare of absolute helplessness, wow, I cannot talk, who had come out alive from the nightmare of absolute helplessness and abandonment, as though the whole world was a jungle and they, its prey, had only one wish, to go where they would never see a non-Jew again. I was like, that was very striking. So I'm definitely still getting stuff out of this. Again, it's not really an enjoyable read, I think, for obvious reasons, but I am finding it informative, and yeah, I feel like I'm getting a lot out of it. So I will certainly finish this by the end of the month. And then the other buddy read that I'm doing is Sabbath Theater by Philip Roth, which I'm doing as a buddy read with Sandy of Ms. Reads a Lot. So we're currently about 2/3 of the way through this book. We're going to wrap it up by this time next week, so I should wrap this up in my next Friday Reads video. So I won't finish it in November, but I will finish it the next week. So I already said about this book last week that this book is basically like Hamlet if Hamlet was an old pervert. And I've only been given sort of more confirmation of that as we've read farther on this book, because the title of the second section of the part 2 of the book is literally To Be or Not to Be. Mickey Sabbath, the main character, is sort of followed around by the ghost of his mother, and he's sort of haunted by things that have happened in the past. He's having an existential crisis. He keeps having these sort of suicidal ideations. And then at the end of this section that I just read this morning, he's thinking a lot about the play King Lear, as if it wasn't already Shakespearean enough. So this is still going well, although again, Mickey Sabbath is a terrible, absolutely reprehensible character, where just when you think you cannot possibly like him any less and your opinion could not possibly be any lower, he does something else and your opinion is somehow lowered even further, if that were even possible. So yeah, this is, I think, as I said to Sandy, I'm still intrigued by it, even as I am disgusted and repulsed. So good job, Philip Roth. So that's still happening. Oh god, I'm dropping books everywhere. So that's still happening. I am also still reading When the Light of the World Was Subdued, Our Songs Came Through, which is a Norton anthology of Native Nations poetry, edited by Joy Harjo. I'm reading this for Indigithon. I am a little ways over halfway done with this volume, and I think I am going to try to go ahead and finish it in November, so we'll see. I did want to read you one poem that I read in the past few days that struck me particularly. So this is by Robert Davis Hoffman, who is a Tlingit poet. So this is called At the Door of the Native Studies Director. In this place years ago, they educated old language out of you, put you in line in uniform on your own 2 feet. They pointed you in the right direction, but still you squint at that other place, that country hidden within a country. You chase bear, deer, you hunt seal, you fish. This is what you know. This is how you move, leaving only a trace of yourself. Each time you come back, you have no way to tell about this. Years later, you meet their qualifications, native scholar. They give you a job, a corner office. Now you're instructed to remember old language, bring back faded legend, anything that's left. They keep looking in on you sideways. You don't fit here. You no longer fit there. You got sick. They still talk of it, the cheap wine on your breath as you utter in restless sleep what I sketch at your bedside. Tonight, Father, I wrap you in a different blanket. The dance comes easier. I carve them for you. This way you move through me. So yeah, still really enjoying this, getting a lot out of it. And yeah. I am also still reading Olga Tokarczuk's The Books of Jacob. So last week when I asked if I should go ahead and start this and or whether I should read it alongside Dostoevsky's The Idiot, which I am planning to read in December, many of you in the comments just decided to choose chaos and say yes, I should read both of them. So I guess that's what we're gonna do. So I am a little over 150 pages into the Books of Jacob, and it's very interesting so far. I've made it through book 1. Book 1 basically kind of sets up a dichotomy between the non-Jewish Poles and the Jewish Poles. Now I'm into book 2, and in book 2 we're actually introduced to Jacob Frank, but so far there's been a lot of recollections of an old false messiah called Shabbatai Tzvi, who, again, like I said, was a false messiah, and Jacob Frank will also be a false messiah, so I guess that's why there's some recollection about him. But so far, Jacob himself has not appeared much in the first 150 or so pages that I've read, but there are a lot of great lines and descriptions in here. One in particular that I wanted to read you. So this is from a story that's being told by one of the characters named Nachman, who's now a rabbi, and he's sort of writing recollections of his own life. And one of his recollections is being a student of the Baal Shem Tov, who was a real Jewish historical figure who was basically like a religious sage and scholar. So this is in Nachman's recollections of the Baal Shem Tov, who is also called the Besht, by the way, because the Hebrew letters of his name spell Besht. So Besht, Baal Shem Tov, same. Once a Kabbalist asked the Besht if he believed the world to be an emanation of God. Oh yes, he said, the whole world is God. Everyone wholeheartedly seconded this enthusiastic response. And evil? Asked the Kabbalist, tricky and malicious. Evil, too, is God, calmly retorted the Besht, and he was placid. But now a murmur passed through all those present. And soon the voices of other learned tzaddikim and various holy and distinguished men piped up. All conversations in this place provoked violent reactions, the overturning of chairs, sobs, cries, men pulling out their hair. Many times did I watch them debate this very question. And my blood boiled then too, for indeed, how could it be? All that this surrounded us, how to account for it? Under what rubric were we to place hunger and bodily injury, the slaughter of animals and children fell by the plague and laid row upon row in the earth? In such instances, I was never able to shake the impression that ultimately and irrefutably God must not give a damn about us. It sufficed for someone to point out that evil was not evil in itself, but rather only in the eyes of man, and a skirmish would break out at table. Water would spill out from a broken jug and soak into the sawdust on the floor. One man would run out of the room in anger, another would have to be prevented from dealing a blow. Such was the power of the spoken word. And it goes on from there, but I did think that that was a very sort of interesting notion to consider, that the Baal Shem Tov says that evil too is God, and people sort of lost their minds over it. So I found it, I found it sort of a sort of mind-blowing notion to think about, but I appreciated thinking about it. So yeah, I'm enjoying this. There's a lot of stuff happening because it's a sweeping historical epic, but I trust that at some point I will figure out how all the pieces sort of connect together. So it's going well. And then the last book I'm currently reading, I just started yesterday, and that is the Mythical Man-Month by Frederick P. Brooks Jr. And this is basically essays from a computer scientist. And Fred Brooks Jr. Won the Turing Award, which is basically the Nobel Prize of Computer Science. He pioneered the IBM 360 project, which led to a lot of modern day advances in computer engineering and programming and technology. And he also was the founder of the computer science department at UNC Chapel Hill, where I worked for 2 years before I went to graduate school. And so that is really why I'm reading this book, is because I knew Fred Brooks personally. He's still alive, by the way, but I don't really know him anymore. So I knew him personally when I worked in the computer science department, and this is his most famous book that was a staple of the computer science classroom of a lot of schools for many years. So I've only read one essay so far, and it was interesting. Again, I'm not really super into programming and engineering and computer science, but I trust that I will be able to sort of take away what the main points are. So more on this later. So that is everything that I either finished this week or I'm currently reading. So thank you for watching this. If you have thoughts about any of these books, I would love to hear it. Please feel free to let me know that down in the comments below. I hope everyone is staying healthy and well. I hope you're doing good reading whatever you're reading. And until next time, would it kill you to call your mother?